Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of my interview with Greg Henderson. This is Bill Current, founder of the Current Consulting Group, and you're watching another episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. If you'd like to watch past episodes, or if you're looking for part one of this interview with Greg Henderson, you can find past episodes at our website at currentconsultinggroup.com or on any of the major podcast platforms, including our YouTube channel, where you can find past episodes and part one of this two-part interview with Greg Henderson. Now, we didn't originally plan for this to be a two-part episode, but we really went deep into the whole marijuana rescheduling issue, and there's a lot of good information there. I encourage you to go back and to watch that episode. But today I want to bring up a different topic, and I think this is going to, fill this episode up pretty well for you. So, Greg, we've heard a lot about and I'm going to call it the new FAA foreign repair station drug and alcohol testing ruling, when it goes into effect and what it may actually require of covered employers, et cetera. And if you don't mind me saying, I don't think that there's a more respected expert on issues related to the FAA and drug and alcohol testing than Greg Henderson. So I wanted to bring that up and talk about that. And one of the things that you taught me early on, we put out a press release about this, and I was referring to it as the FAA Foreign Repair Station Drug and Alcohol Testing Regulations. And you corrected me and said, don't use the word regulations yet, use the word ruling. So tell us what this is and why you corrected me on that.
Well, because right now, the FAA have not put out any actual advisory circular, official advisory circular, or any changes to in a broader perspective of the actual oversight requirements for the International Repair Station. There's been some memos, and there may have been some blurbs here and there, but from my understanding, drug abatement have not put out an official, here's an advisory circular, here's what we're looking for, and this is what we're doing. So right now, people are operating off of, the ruling, that have put out and their own inquiries to, drug abatement and their responses from them, but as far as out to the public, I haven't seen a full, separated advisory circular, giving any further guidance.
So from sort of a 30,000 foot perspective, once this goes into effect, what basically does the ruling suggest will be required?
Well, the ruling basically is going to govern the responsibilities under 4940 and 120, as it pertains to each country. So each country will have to submit, for a waiver to say, hey, we're going to meet these requirements to the best of our ability based on our country requirements. Is this acceptable? And they would have to kind of submit that to the FAA in regards to, pre-employment, random, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, and follow-up and return to duty. So that is going to be the complex part of it all, is how do each repair station, come up with their perceived processes, for that.
So would it be, you work with a lot of major airline companies. I won't name names, but they're some of the biggest that you work with as a consultant. What are they asking? What are they concerned about?
Well, how I have to do it, Bill, is I have to break it down into kind of segments when I'm speaking. Like if I'm speaking directly to repair stations or to airlines or to third party, or other consultants, the concerns are a little different. So when it comes to the airlines, they have they cannot wait until 2027. And that's for everybody. It goes into compliance enforcement December of 2027. Okay. So as of 2025, when the ruling first came out, I believe that a lot of airline, you know, especially when it comes to the director of maintenance and safety, individuals, that they've been kicking the can down the road because it's more of hoping that this goes away, that it kind of, minimize it, oh, these countries aren't going to follow these rules. And, that kind of language has been going around in the industry, but yet, however, it's moving forward. And there's no difference than what we were talking about with the rescheduling, is that you have to be careful of where and how you get this information. And you have to operate, as I guide them on, you have to operate on what's current. So what they have to be concerned with is, if these repair stations do not adhere to these requirements, is it going to disrupt, their operation in 2027? Will the vendor availability be there if that become an issue? If these countries, these repair stations do not submit for these waivers or get these approvals, how is that going to disrupt their operations on both sides? And then the operational constraints of the operation specifications when it comes to not just the drug and alcohol side of it, but also the Flight Standard District Office of the FAA, which is the FSDO. How is that going to impact your repair station operations and oversight from that side of the FAA as well? So that's what the major airlines are more in concerns with right now. But the airlines should be asking now, are our repair stations covered? Do they have an acceptable FAA drug and alcohol plan right now? Or are they in process of implementing that plan? And if not, what is that timeline? What is that timeline in 2026 or even bleeding into 27? Because it's not going to be as simple as just taking paperwork and submitting it to the FAA and getting this instant response. The government just does not respond, that way. So if you constantly move forward throughout the year, bleeding into 27, because I believe that the FAA is probably going to have a cutoff when it comes to the workload of trying to respond to an onslaught of these last minute waivers that are coming in. So people are going to fall short. So if you're not beginning your conversations and implementing these plans right now, whether the airline, whether you are the repair station, then you're going to fall behind.
So what's the whole issue with exemptions? Is it going to be possible for some entities to be exempted from the ruling?
Well, the problem is, they're still going to have to submit for that exemption. So if you wait for the last minute, you still have to put this package together to get that exemption, which is the waiver. So you still have to submit your policy, your processes, how you're going to test. If your country says that, well, we don't do this, but the repair station is still responsible for, 4940 guidelines and 120. So how are you going to offset, these testings? And that is going to be the challenge. So that is the exemption, which is the waiver.
Okay. And then one other question related to that. In our previous episode, part one of our interview, we talked most of the time about the rescheduling of marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. And, you were talking a little bit about whether or not that will impact DOT testing requirements and, that whole issue. I don't want to necessarily go back into that. But how does that potentially impact the repair station ruling, but also the FAA regulations in general?
Well, it still is, they're going to have to move accordingly, to, whatever comes out and make the necessary adjustments. I think as long as it goes back to, putting the emphasis on safety, how does this impact safety from the changing of that? So it's going to have some impact on it, but it's just, again, educating and reassessing your testing processes that you can still adhere to, that we're making these adjustments and this is in the best interest of safety, right? So those individuals, when these rulings do come out as final, you're making more of a reassessment instead of letting it go away, instead of dropping it that's why they have to talk to people like yourself, myself, or whoever does, along the line, is how do we keep them aligned with testing and safety?
Yeah. So one of the things we've said over the years related to what you just said is that for an employer, they must, if they're covered by the DOT regulations, for example, whether it's FAA or FMCSA, et cetera, they must comply with those specific requirements. But the regulations don't limit them to what's in the requirement. In other words, if the employer on its own volition, in compliance with the state laws that apply to them, want to test for additional drugs, they can. Or if they want to do random testing at a different frequency rate, as long as they're complying with the DOT regulations where they're covered, they can do more than that. So my question is, if there's some, and I don't think this is going to happen personally, but if there's some question about whether or not under the DOT regulations, an employer is going to be required to test for marijuana in the future, that that's creates a lot of confusion, and maybe employers they decide not to test for marijuana maybe they're not actually required to test for marijuana under the regulations on their own authority. Again, complying with the state laws that apply to them, they could still test for marijuana, right?
Right, and that's where we were talking about whether it's the international ruling or whether it's the regular process is that as long as you're adhering to the regulations and the requirements for federal testing, but then you have to get into understanding and educating how to maneuver through your company testing processes as well, that offsets whatever you can't do under the federal regulation. And again, when you sit down with your consultants or whatever, they'll be the ones to help educate you on how to establish your policies, because now you're moving from DOT over federal oversight to civil oversight, which is now you don't want to potentially put yourself into, civil lawsuits and stuff because you're, don't have a policy that governs responsibility over everybody. And that's where it comes. Okay, if you're going to remove it from here, then what does your company policy? Because again, it's going to be about safety.
Yeah.
How does this now adhere to the responsibility of safety? So if your assessment comes back and say the number one response was safety, then how do you now adjust your company, policies to offset what is not done on the federal side?
Yeah. And as we talked about in the last episode, in Current Consulting Group's 2025 employer survey, the number one reason that employers identified for conducting drug testing is to improve safety in the workplace. So let me bring up one other example. So lots of times people make the argument that marijuana should be treated the same as alcohol, and I'm not sure that argument really works in their favor once you really sort of talk it through. But recently, not too long ago, and I won't name the airline, that's not the important part, but there was a pilot who was taken off the plane because he was accused of having consumed alcohol within the hour framework of the flight. In other words, he had violated the regulation by doing that. And at the time that I heard about that, Greg, and I know you know the FAA regulations better than anybody, the time when I heard that, I thought to myself, well, would I treat somebody who just smoked a couple of joints differently than somebody who had 3 or 4, name your alcoholic beverage, before the flight, right? As somebody who's had major surgery myself, I wouldn't really want my surgeon to be high on marijuana just before he opens me up. In the same way that I wouldn't want my pilot who's going to take me from Florida to California to be under the influence of alcohol or for that matter, marijuana. And I think it comes back to what you've been saying all along, which is, it's a safety issue.
Right. Right. And that has been the first thing, when this all started, back when Obama, his administration started dipping into, the marijuana world as far as the reclassification and then moving forward on, that has been one of the things. Well, the bus driver who's driving your kids and such, again, if it becomes that ruling, then it goes back to you as an organization, as a company, as to what are you going to do to offset that. Just because it may not be over here, but doesn't mean that you can't test over, in another aspect of it. And if you really, want to be for the betterment of safety, it doesn't need to go away in its entirety. Just like you can't be impaired under alcohol, even though it's legal. There's a time period for all of that. My biggest concern when it comes to marijuana, unlike alcohol, at least alcohol goes through a process and the proof and what's actually in it. With marijuana, you don't really know how high someone really is because of what can be added to marijuana, lacing it with different entities or whatever. So it's a lot of uncertainties when it comes to just smoking marijuana. That's just my opinion. I don't know how you can control the potency of something or how high someone really is when it comes to marijuana.
Thank you, Greg. That's all great information. And if somebody would like to get a hold of you and talk to you about the FAA foreign repair station drug and alcohol testing ruling or anything to do with the FAA regulations, how can they get a hold of you?
You can reach me again at federaldrugtesting@gmail.com or federaldrugtestingservices.com. And on my website, you'll see everything that I offer, whether it's training, consulting, the international, or even locations that I'll be, giving my classes and speaking as well. And before we go, I just want to again, remind those who are Part 121 aircraft holders and repair stations that it is 2026 now. This ruling is going to be in compliance enforcement in 27. And trust me, this is not a simple process when it comes to putting this waiver together and submitting it and waiting on a response. So if you wait much longer going into 2026, it could potentially impact your operations if you're not already in motion, with this process.
Yeah, and let me also say to our audience, Greg has extensive experience with HHS, with Part 40, with the FAA regulations, also with federal motor carrier as well, because a lot of these, aviation industry companies also have drivers as well. But and so there's really between Current Consulting Group and Greg Henderson, we can answer virtually any question you have about the DOT regulations. But I want to point out that we got a question, I think it was yesterday, Greg, about U.S. Coast Guard, and that's just not my area of expertise. I'll admit it. I sent it to Greg, and within an hour, I had an answer to that question. So even Coast Guard questions, we can probably take a stab at for you. So if you need any help, contact us at currentconsultinggroup.com or Greg's email, and we'd be happy to try to help answer your questions for you. Greg, thank you again for joining us, and I know you're not giving legal advice, and we don't want to mislead anybody into that, but thank you for speaking candidly about these regulations.
Well, one of the things, Bill, when you talk about that in my responses is that I'm always going to respond with some type of language from regulations, advisory circular, or whatever. Like, I just don't respond with how Greg thinks. It's not Greg's way, it's the reg's way.
Yeah, I agree. We do that same thing when we're answering state law questions. Here's the answer. Here's where you can find it in the Minnesota statute, et cetera. That's just the best way to do it. So anyways, thank you again. Thank you, audience, for joining us. If you have any questions, you know how to reach us. And if you want to look at past episodes or part 1 of my interview with Greg Henderson, go to currentconsultinggroup.com. You'll find the archives of all of our past episodes of Currently Speaking. And with that, we wish you a great day. Thanks.